Hello, it's Chino here. Today I want to cover my game of the day from round 3 of the FIDE candidates, and it's between the top two seeds in the tournament, Ding Liren and Fabiano Caruana. So Ding Liren had the white pieces, Caruana had the black pieces, and what we have here is a Slav. So after the mainline moves, we had this variation with bishop to f5, and now Ding Liren went for the line with knight e5, and just taking a step back. A less risky alternative was to go pawn to e3, and when play could go e6 for black, and bishop takes c4, bishop b4, castles, knight b to d7, and queen to b3 with a different type of game. Yeah, so if we just go back a couple of moves to the position after bishop f5 and knight e5, black continued with the natural pawn to e6, continuing to develop the pieces, and now f3. So we now see the point of knight to e5 to make way for the f3 pawn, which would subsequently be followed by the move pawn to e4. Black continues to play actively as per the main line, bishop to b4, and now knight takes c4. And just going back one move, it's important to note that pawn to e4, which looks like a natural move, is actually a big mistake here, because black can continue bishop takes e4, and after pawn takes e4, knight takes e4. White will be forced to play something like bishop to d2 to avoid, the double exchange on c3. But then we end up with one of these crazy positions where after something like queen takes d4, knight takes e4, queen takes e4 check, queen to e2, only move, because obviously the knight at e5 has to be defended. Bishop takes d2, check, king takes d2, queen to d5, check, king to c2, knight a6, where if you look at the position closely, black's ended up with well, 3 pawns for a minor piece. I mean, the c4 pawn's gonna fall soon, but if you do a piece count here, and we see the black's got 3 pawns for a piece, which should be good enough for equality. Okay, so going back to the position we were at after bishop to b4, we saw that e4 wasn't such a good idea. Oh well, it didn't have not that it wasn't such a good idea. It just didn't give white too many chances after bishop takes e4. So instead of that move, we saw knight takes c4 from Ding Liren, and black simply castles. Now this is another key position in this opening. White went king to f2, but again, let's just see what happens after a move like pawn to e4. Now it turns out that this is also a mistake as well, because black can continue knight takes e4. Notice he takes with the knight this time instead of the bishop, and the reason is to give the queen some room on the diagonal. So for example, after pawn takes e4, queen to h4 check, when white's forced to move the king, note that pawn to g3 isn't possible because of this check and winning the rook in the corner. So just going back, so after queen to h4 check, white has to go king to d2, but black gets, you know, some really strong counterplay, you know, after queen takes e4, and it's probably even better in this position. Now, so for that reason, so just going back a bit, so here we've just seen again e4 doesn't work in this position, and so white correctly went king f2, which is the main line. And this was another curious point in the game because Caruana played a surprising move, and probably a novelty because I can't find it in any of the games in my database, and that was the move pawn to e5. But just before we look at how the game went, it's just worth noting the more common move is pawn to c5, attacking the center, and because of the awkward placement of the white king, and the main line goes something like pawn to e4, and when the bishop has to move back to g6 in this position, particular position, exchanges don't work on e4, because the white king can always escape to the g1 square. So anyway, so bishop g6 is the main line, and then white would typically continue knight to a2, trying to win the bishop pair. So for example, after knight to c6, knight takes b4, etc. I mean, the point in this variation is white has a bishop pair, but this is just about equally offset by black's lead in development. Yeah, and there have been many discussions, you know, in this variation in the opening, and it's probably the way to go if you're to play black. But chess is all about surprises and novelties. So if we go back to the position after king to f2, yeah, we saw this new move e5. Now, I mean, black has to strike in the center because of the awkward placement of the white king. But I think the game continuation shows that perhaps c5 is a better alternative. So let's see what happens. So white just simply played the natural move, knight takes e5, and we saw some activity from black, but yeah, the activity didn't last very long. So bishop to c2, threatening the queen. Is worth noting here that queen takes c2 is impossible because of queen takes d4 check, followed by queen takes e5 on the next move. Into the queen takes c2, and we saw queen to d2 by white, and now c5. So yeah, this is the move we thought should have been played 2 moves ago. But here, white has the option of just simply playing d5. And after bishop b3, because obviously now the bishop is hanging on c2, e4 just simply secures, you know, the pawn on d5. So white's a pawn up and has, if you like, the pass pawn on the d file, protected pass pawn on the d file. I mean, black gets a bit of counterplay, but it's not clear it's enough in this position. So we saw rook to e8, and this was another curious point in the game. White had to play an accurate move in queen to f4, because, for example, a move like bishop to c4, you know, aiming to just exchange bishops, would be met by bishop takes c4, and after knight takes c4, the tactical shot rook takes e4. Obviously, the point being pawn takes e4 isn't possible because of knight takes e4, and if knight takes e4, bishop takes e4, bishop takes d2. If you do a piece count here, you'll see white is up material, but the key point and why black's better in this position is because of the exposed placement of the white king. So yeah, so I mean, this is an ill-advised variation for white to go into. So yeah, after the position with rook to e8, white found this important move, and queen to f4. Now, this is worth noting here. This bishop on b3 is a bit awkwardly placed. Can't do anything, but at the same time, this diagonal, the knight and the queen on the same diagonal, is a bit awkward for white. So black tried c4 with the pseudo threat of bishop to d6, but obviously this gives away another pawn after knight takes c4. But black does have some activity in compensation for the 2 pawns, but whether or not it's enough, it's a big question. I mean, my engines don't look too optimistic for black. So white continued with a natural developing move, bishop to e3. And here, black went knight to f8. Now, the key point here is the threat is knight to g6, trying to embarrass the queen on f4. Because if that move's allowed, the queen would have very few squares to go to. Okay, so bishop to d4. Trying to create some squares for the queen, and at the same time covering the e5 square to prevent a rook from going there one day. And I guess black saw nothing better than to continue with knight to g6, threatening the queen. But perhaps a better move instead of knight to g6 would have been rook to c8, forcing knight to e3. And after knight to g6 threatening the queen, queen to g3, and something like bishop takes c3, pawn takes c3, and now another one of these shots, tactical shots, rook takes e4. Obviously, pawn takes e4 is impossible because of knight takes e4, attacking forking both the king and the queen. Okay, so knight g6. So after knight to g6, I think this is where white's advantage starts to show, because white goes queen to f5. Remember the bishop going to d4, so now there isn't a possibility of embarrassing the queen with rook to e5, even after bishop takes c4. We saw bishop takes c4, bishop takes c4, queen to c7, threatening the bishop, and now just simply bishop to e2. Now black obviously has to find some play in the position, so why not try bishop to c5, trying to get to the black king. But I mean, it's a bit futile. I mean, what we need to remember here is white has 2 solid pawns up in this position. So after the simple bishop takes c5, queen takes c5 check, white simply went king to f1. And if we just take stock of this position, all white has to do is simply consolidate the placement of his pieces to realize a winning advantage. I mean, 2 pawns is a lot to give away, especially between 2 super GMs. So h6, rook to d1. Black try queen to b6, trying desperately to create some kind of counterplay, but all of this isn't enough. Rook to d2, calmly developing the pawn, queen to e3, rook simply moves away to c2, protecting the c1 square, and black again tried a6, I think aiming to play b5 like we'll soon see, but after queen to h3, b5, and queen g3, Obviously, white doesn't want to open lines against the king with pawn takes b5. So after queen to h3, b5, queen to g3, b4. White just calmly played knight to d1, and the point here is that after, say, queen to b3 and rook to d2 and queen takes a4, even though white's gained back one of the pawns, I mean, white's not too far off consolidating with the extra pawn. And I think the other critical thing is the 2 pawns, the protected pass pawn in the center of the board, which is already on fifth rank. So yeah, part of the consolidation strategy, queen to f2. I guess planning to play pawn to g3, queen to g2. And then after, say, queen to d7, I suppose making way for the a5 push, a5 to a4 to a3 push. I mean, black just simply continued pawn to g3. Black tried a futile queen to h3 check. Yeah, but that was a bit futile. A5 happened, queen to d4, knight to h5, and after knight to f2, queen had to go back to d7, and then we saw f4. And at this point, I think black became desperate and tried a sacrifice that didn't really work. And knight takes f4, I suppose, to try and open lines against the white king, but it wasn't enough here because we saw discontinuation. And yeah, white just slowly consolidated his position and took home the full point. I mean, we'll just go through a few more moves just before we end this, but I think it's clear to say white's a good piece up with a reasonable position. After a few more moves, it's only a matter of time before black resigned. So yeah, this was a very interesting game between the top 2 seeds of the tournament. I mean, we'll stop the game here. If we were to recap and go back to the main position in the opening, after knight to e5, e6, f3, bishop b4, knight to c4, castles, king to f2. We saw this experiment by black, pawn to e5, which didn't really work. So, I mean, in hindsight, I think c5 is a better move, which is the main line. But it'll be interesting to see if any more grandmasters try this out in practice. I hope you enjoyed this. Don't forget to subscribe, and yeah, hope to see you again.